My name is Andrew Bray, and I teach classes in statistics and data science at UC Berkeley. And I want to start off this talk with a story going back 2 years to March of 2022. So the semester is coming to a close. I have a final that I have to give in a couple weeks. And so what do? I procrastinate writing my final because it's really hard to write finals. So I do everything that I can to not write a final. And I do my favorite form of procrastination, which is going on my laptop, going to NewYorkTimes.com and clicking through articles and pretending that I'm edifying myself while I'm procrastinating. And while doing that, I came across this article. So it's called A Poem and a Painting About the Suffering That Hides in Plain Sight by Eliza Gabbert. I want to read it to you. I've been reading this short, wry poem about suffering for more than 20 years. How nice that it tells you in the first 2 words what it's about. No matter how familiar a poem is, rereading it always gives me a sense of first encounter, as though I've gone back to sleep and re-entered the dream through a different door. And the article goes on. This is a form of web design called Scrollytelling, where you have a narrative that's scrolling down the page as you scroll, but that scrolling behavior is modifying what you're looking at. So it could be panning across images, it could be highlighting text, it could be zooming into text, it could be playing a video. And as I read to the very bottom of this, I looked up at the clock, 25 minutes have passed. This is a very long article. And I was just realizing what just happened. I don't consider myself a huge poetry guy. And yet I just spent 25 minutes reading about a poem by W.H. Auden and found it fascinating. And I realized that it really was the medium that was so effective at engaging my interest. So I think about, as a teacher, how can I provide materials that my students will engage with when they're reading it? And I thought, man, if I could engage my students just a fraction of the way that Eliza Gabbert was able to engage me, this is going to be really powerful. So I started to think, how can I take Quarto and create a Scrollytelling story like this? And 2 years ago, I came to PositConf, and I'd kind of drummed something up very hacky. I showed it to Mina, and she's like, that's nice. You should talk to James. So this is James Goldie. He's a data journalist, and he lives in Melbourne, Australia. And it turns out he had been thinking about the exact same thing, not from a teacher's perspective, but from a data journalist perspective. And he'd also drummed together kind of his first try at Quarto Scrollytelling. So this started off a 2-year collaboration that has resulted in a new Quarto custom format that we're pleased to share with you called Closeread. So Closeread, it's a Quarto extension that enables Scrollytelling to, it can do lots of things, but today I'm going to show you 3 documents in which we'll study text, we'll study images, we'll study code, all to make a stronger, more focused narrative. All right, so we're going to start off with studying text, but actually, before I get there, I just want to say that in the course of this talk, I want to give you a sense of how easy it can be to author one of these things in Quarto, but I also want to see if we can drum up, what is it about Scrollytelling that makes it so engaging? What exactly is it as a storytelling medium? So that's another thing I'm going to try to figure out. All right. I'm also just going to, some jargon here that I might actually not need to cover now because it's come up in the previous talks. One is this notion of a fenced div. So if you have a block of content in your Quarto doc, you can wrap it in triple colons, and then inside curly braces, give it things like identifiers, classes, and attributes. So you can encode a lot of information in the different components of your document. If you have a block of content in your document, you'd use the fenced div. If you have just a part of, say, a paragraph, you'd instead use the bracketed span. So very similar syntax. You can pass the same amount of information, but you're going to use these square brackets instead of the triple colons. All right, so that's kind of going to be the syntax that we'll leverage here in our extension. All right, so for our first document, I'm actually going to try to recreate just a bit, start towards recreating that New York Times article. It should be said that that article, I got in touch with Eliza Gabbert. She was really gracious, telling me about the process. It's impressive what they're doing at the Times. It took 5 people several months to produce that article, and it's a masterpiece. One of those people was Eliza Gabbert. 4 of them were web designers. And if you look through the HTML, it's really boutique to exactly what they're doing here. So the goal is to kind of allow somebody who doesn't have a team of web designers to do something like that. All right, so here is the title and the first couple lines of Eliza Gavert's piece. And here it's just as a straight HTML file. If I were to render it, I would see kind of a familiar sort of format. In order to get towards the Scrollytelling, the first thing that I'm going to do is actually do something that's purely aesthetic. So I'm just going to add some CSS that will bring in some identifiable fonts. And I'm actually going to do something that has been in Quarto for as long as it's been around. I just learned that it exists. It's called the line block. So if you have text that you want to preserve the formatting into your rendered document, you can precede on the left side by a pipe and then a space. That will create what's called a line block. And, oops, there it is. And you'll get that poem at the bottom looking like a poem. And then now we have this New York Times fonts or similar fonts. All right, but to really make this a Scrollytelling story, we're going to need to do a couple things. We're going to start off by changing the format there on line 2 to be Closeread HTML. And then we're going to wrap all of our content in a fence div and give it the class CR section. What that'll do is give us this identifiable 2-column layout where we have a narrative block and then a block on the right where our content will land. If we go ahead and scroll down that, you'll realize, okay, so it's separated out each of those paragraphs. That's cool. But right now the poem is actually showing up there in the narrative side. So that's the default. Kind of in a CR section, everything gets tossed into the sidebar. What we need to do next is be clear that it's this poem that we really want to study. So the way that we flag it as such is we wrap it in a fence div and then we give it an ID. And we prefix that ID with CR hyphen. So that's the first step. And the second step is that we provide a reference to it in the paragraph where we'd like it to appear when that paragraph hits the middle of the viewport. So in terms of our own lingo around this, we call the poem now is called a sticky, because we think about it like a sticky note that is going to stay in the middle of the screen as you're scrolling the narrative. And then we call the reference to it a trigger, because it's going to trigger different effects. All right, so with that in place, we can go ahead and watch it. And there we go. As that first trigger comes into view, it's going to make the poem appear. So we're getting kind of looking somewhat convincing, but they have lots of effects that they're triggering, not just the poem appearing. One thing that they did is they were highlighting text and they were zooming into it. So we can do that. First thing that we're going to need to do is specify there with a bracketed span where we want to highlight and zoom. So I'm going to call that the CR suffering. And then we need to provide a trigger for it. And here we're appending a little bit of extra information to our trigger saying, when this one triggers, highlight and zoom, HLZ, that span CR suffering. And once we've done that, the first block will make it appear. And now the second block will highlight and kind of center it in the viewport. All right, so just to recap, what did we learn? To write a Closeread story, you're going to create the Closeread section, step 1. Step 2 is flag content as stickies, sticky notes that'll appear and stick around as you're scrolling down. And then identify blocks to serve as triggers of different things appearing or having focus effects. All right, so, as I'm trying to think, okay, that was Closeread, our implementation. What did we learn about Scrollytelling? Well, we found ourselves drawn to Quarto's built-in cross-referencing syntax. And we've realized that Scrollytelling, it's really using kind of spatial cross-referencing. It's replacing in a static document where you would say, like, see figure 5. Now it's just figure 5 is there. So you don't need that. It's the spatial kind of concordance between the sticky and the trigger that's doing the work and kind of reducing that cognitive load for your reader, which I think is part of its power. All right, so that was text. Let's go ahead and study some images. So this is maybe one of the most famous images in the history of data visualization, Napoleon's March on Moscow. This is as it appears in Edward Tufte's The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. This is page 40. And, he does a terrific job, I should say, speaking of cross-references, of being sure that the figure that he is describing is always on the same 2-page spread as where he's describing it. you will not need to turn a page to see the figure that he's discussing. But let's see if we can kind of make this even easier to read by using a close read. So here's a start of this document. I've already created it as a close read document, and we can see Edward Tufte's text is in there, just the start of it, as well as an image for Menard's map. If we look at that, it just stacks it kind of like a normal HTML article. To create the close read section, we need to open up that div. That happens right there. The second step is that we need to identify the sticky. That's going to be the map. And the third thing is we need to make a trigger. And let's just make the first one trigger it. So that'll go ahead, and that first paragraph, since it shows up in the middle of the viewport, Menard's map is just right there. But nothing's really changing right now. And his text actually is really descriptive about where you should be looking in this map to see different things. So let's return to his text. The second line in his paragraph where he's describing it, he's saying something like, beginning at the left at the German-Polish border at the Niemen River, you see something. So we can just go ahead and say, well, trigger there some panning behavior. So we want to pan a little bit to the left, a little bit down, and I'd like to zoom in a bit, scaling the image. When I do that, when that paragraph comes into view, now we can see, actually, you can see the Niemen River, you can see that national border, and see the thick tan flow line showing the size of the Grand Army. All right, so the next paragraph is just describing what that band says, but the following one says something like, in September, the army reaches Moscow. So let's bring Moscow into view just by panning and scaling again, right there. And now when we hit that fourth narrative block, it'll pan over there to Moscow. So if you'd like to see a more extended version of this, you can go on our website, which I'll show at the very end, that plays a little bit more with this graphic. But just to recap what we learned here, we're still going to be using this focusing behavior, but now we're going to be using panning and scaling to zoom around our images. And I've done this in the context of images, but actually this behavior, panning and scaling, works for any type of sticky. We could actually pan and scale that poem if we wanted to, or any text, or any code. It's a really general behavior here. There's quite a few focus effects right now. There's the panning, there's the scaling. We saw HLZ in the poem, that was highlight and zoom, or you can do them individually, highlighting and zooming. Okay, so just before we leave this one behind, I just want to point out that read this paragraph. It says, or I guess it's a sentence, beginning at left on the Polish-Russian border near the Niemen River. All of that is all just telling you where you should be looking here. So, now that we have it right alongside, it's not really necessary, it's superfluous. And I think what this has flagged for me in putting this together is when you're writing text for Scrollytelling, it's just categorically different than static text, because static text has a lot of where you should be looking, not what you're looking at. So what this has taught me is that Scrollytelling allows the reader to focus on the what instead of the where. And this is just a good flag of when you might want to write a Scrollytelling article, is if you look back on your writing and it's all just telling you to look at on the third sentence of the fourth paragraph on the 6th page, maybe just show them right next to that exactly where you're referring to. All right. Finally, we're going to look at a little bit of code. So we're going to start here with a pretty familiar, pretty simple example. We have some R code, in this case, a dplyr pipeline, and we want to walk our readers through what it's doing. So we have the familiar elements. We have the CR section being opened. We have the now whole code cell is being flagged as a sticky. I'm calling that CR dplyr. And then we are referring to it with a trigger. If we go ahead and take a look at what that produces, you just have the side-by-side layout, and we have the code and the output. To walk a viewer through it, this is a classic case for code highlighting. So to do that, say in this second narrative block, I could say I'd like to highlight lines 1 and 2. Right there. And now when I scroll down to that, it'll just highlight the loading of the packages. If we'd like to highlight more than just one line at a time, we can highlight a range. So say that we'd like to highlight lines 4 through 8. And then when we get down to that third paragraph, we'll see the actual dplyr pipeline. All right, so what we saw here is some syntax around attribute, some focus of X that we can use, highlighting line numbers, highlighting ranges of line numbers. You can also highlight spans. But in fact, this exact syntax we could have used over in the text. So in the Closeread custom format, pretty much anything, almost anything you can do for text, you can do for code, and anything you can do for code, you can do for text. There's one small exception. So this is actually kind of a not that exciting of an example, my third example about telling you about code. The example that I really want to tell you about is not showing code, but thinking about your user's behavior in your document as data that you can use to modify the graphics that they're looking at. Okay, so let me just show you an example to explain what I mean by this. This is a little Closeread, the objective of which is just to draw a globe that shows where James and I live. So we can see we are opening the section. Something different here, we're specifying we don't want the sidebar layout. I want actually the narrative to scroll down the middle. So I'm switching it to overlay center. I have a little trigger here saying that I would want to see the globe when I describe where I live. And then here's the code that's going to generate the globe. So in this case, I'm using OJS in the plot package. This first code cell is loading in some data. The second code cell is actually creating this globe using Observable plots package. And I'm not terribly familiar with this package. James definitely is, so James put this together. And if you scroll down to the very bottom, you see there's a little specification of the projection that just says how do you want the globe to be rotated? And I wanted it rotated at a longitude of 122, so that when I go ahead and render it, we get to see where I live in Berkeley, California. But I could have done this with a static graphics library. OJS is interactive graphics, so we can do better than this. But we're going to need one more piece of information. We need to be tracking where your user is scrolling. So what I've done here is I've extended these narrative blocks. My collaborator, James, lives very, very far away. I want each of them to trigger some behavior on the globe, and I'm wrapping it in a div called progress block. Now what that's going to do is make available to our code cells, our OJS code cells, an OJS variable called CR progress block. So now I'm just going to show you what this looks like. What you're going to see in the upper right-hand corner now, it's the same document pretty much, but we're actually going to just see the value of CR progress block. Oops. See, it starts near 0. As you scroll down, it starts approaching 1. All right. So that's something we can use. We're storing the data on what our user is doing. So the way we're going to use it is we're going to go ahead and add a little bit more code in here that's modifying on line 31 that 0 to 1 variable and mapping it to longitudes, 180 to -160. And then we're going to swap out that static hard-coded 122 longitude and replace it with this dynamic one. And let's see what happens. So we learned that James lives very, very far away. So this is a fairly simple example, just rotating a globe. It's kind of a proof of concept, but there are all sorts of very, very complex interactive graphics that using Scrollytelling, you can give your user really easy control over what they're seeing in that graphic. All right, so just to recap here, you can span narrative blocks with progress blocks, and then you have this CR progress block OJS variable. There are actually 4 others that we make available as well. And we also saw that there are choices in terms of layout. Okay. So I guess what did I learn from this last section? Well, I learned that Scrollytelling is a great match for interactive graphics. And I think there's lots of potential for interactive graphics, storytelling in a teaching context and in a data journalism context. So different ways that you could think about using Closeread. I would guess James is thinking about having a Closeread section in one of his data journalism articles. As a teacher, I'm thinking about, okay, if I have a particularly tricky concept and I can't be in front of my students to explain it, maybe I'll prepare a Closeread article. I'm also thinking about maybe my students as they're working on their projects in data analysis, asking them to walk their reader through an analysis by writing a Closeread project. I'm also imagining folks that are working in industry trying to communicate a central insight of an analysis to company decision makers. So I've seen lots of amazing dashboards that today at this conference, and I see so many options, so much richness, so much complexity that's wonderful, but also maybe for a new user would benefit from a more guided, curated tour through something like a Closeread article. And finally, you can use it as a guide to software that you produce. So with that, I just direct you to our document site, closeread.netlify.app, where you can learn all about it. Thanks very much.